again, I think the United States is the least trustworthy country from my experience. And that goes with the arrogance of power. The US walks out of one treaty after another. Russia does not. The United States walked out of the ABM Treaty. The United States walked out of the Open Skies Treaty. The United States walked out of the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty. The United States has overthrown about 100 governments in regime change operations. So I'm not impressed at just pointing the finger at Russia. There have been many, many treaties that Russia is still in, that is abided by. And I go with the dictum of President John F. Kennedy in his wonderful peace speech in June 10, 1963, when he says that great powers can be counted upon to observe those treaties and only those treaties that are in their interests. And so if we make a good treaty that is in Russia's interest and in Ukraine's interest and in America's interest, it will stick.
Thank you. Sivan, do you have another question?
Yes, along this same line, Papa Fernandez asks if it would have been acceptable for Ukraine to join the EU rather than NATO.
Yes, I think the answer is yes. The issue, though, is the EU made a bad mistake in its modern history. It became basically the same as NATO, almost in formal legal terms. The EU-NATO relationship is not some independent, distant relationship. Being part of the EU is pretty much tantamount to being in NATO. Being in NATO is pretty much tantamount to being in the EU. And one of the saddest mistakes for the European Union is that it co-located NATO headquarters and EU headquarters in Brussels. And that's not a coincidence. They became the same thing. And that is where the problem was. We never had just a straight proposal to join the EU, never, because already in 2008, the United States was pushing relentlessly for NATO enlargement. And NATO fell into line because this is a US-led alliance. So your question, a good one, was never tested and never asked.
The EU is militarizing, as some people say. You know, they're developing their own somewhat stronger defense policy. Would that not be a concern to Putin? Would he really be happy with Ukraine joining the European Union in its new, stronger military form?
I personally believe it's fine for Europe to have its own autonomous security and military, not to go marching off to war, but as a credible deterrence. I personally would be perfectly more than satisfied with NATO ending and the EU having its own military security. Russia's not going to obsess about that. What they're concerned about is the United States, which is a nuclear superpower. We have, along with Russia, we're the only two countries that have 1,600 actively deployed nuclear weapons. The United States has nuclear capacity and many other space technologies and so forth that Russia fears about a decapitation strike or other existential threats to Russia that the EU would not cause. So for the European Union to have deterrence, in my view, is fine. And I think whether I like it or not, NATO very well may not exist in 10 years from now in any event. Trump has little interest in it. And I think that Europe wants and needs some kind of strategic autonomy. I don't, where I fault the European leadership tremendously is that they should engage in diplomacy with Russia. They haven't even tried. They literally have not tried. They have not gone to Moscow. They have not met with Lavrov. They have not invited Lavrov to meet with them. They have not tried at all to have diplomacy for years. And
Right, I take that. But we are talking about kind of all the time what the US should do, what the Europeans should do, and not wrongly partially. But isn't there something Russia should do as well? When you look at Eastern Europe, there's real anxiety about Russia, real or perceived anxiety. If you look at the Baltic states, they are seriously worried. Poland has pushed up its military defense, not because they like to spend money, but they feel threatened. Norway, Finland and Sweden have joined NATO, and there is general anxiety around. And that comes not out of nothing. You know, Putin in particular has gone into Georgia, into Moldova. He still occupies part of it. Then, of course, what we discussed was Crimea and the full invasion, and whether you try to explain that, that there are good reasons for all that, but there is still a lot of anxiety, and Russia is perceived as an aggressive country. What can the Russians do to actually reassure their immediate neighbors that they are not aggressive, that all that perception is totally wrong? So Putin needs to deliver something as well. And I think we haven't talked about that at all. We only talk about what the West can do. What can Russia do?
I have to say, just an example with Georgia. It's not that Russia was the aggressor to Georgia. It was the same story in 2008. I don't want to go into I don't want to quibble in details, but I watched Saakashvili provoke this disaster. I absolutely watched it close up. It was quite shocking. The guy was crazy in my view. I actually left a talk that he gave at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, called my wife and said, "This man is out of his mind." That was May, and then the war came the next month. So Georgia, I don't put as an example of this.
I mean, we don't want to discuss Saakashvili here.
I know.
The Russians still occupy 2 parts of Georgia. They could have withdrawn.
Okay.
In the meantime, they have.
Okay. What I believe, absolutely, there should be diplomacy. And one of the things I've always said to the Europeans is, you're worried about Russia? Okay, understandable. Ask Lavrov the very question that you just asked me. What is the security for the Baltic states? I'd like to hear from Lavrov. He's an extremely intelligent person. What are you going to say? You've given a good challenge. That's an absolutely appropriate thing to ask the Russian side. How can we trust you? Why should we trust you? What kind of security arrangements should we have? Now, let me say something about the Baltics, by the way, because all of this requires, detailed context. Latvia has a 25% Russian population. Estonia has a 20% Russian population. Lithuania has a 5% Russian population. I would think, that being on Russia's border and with a substantial Russian minority population, you would take some prudence, you would take some care. And again, I want to explain where I'm coming from. I advise the Estonian government. I help them. I have a high national award from Estonia. I like these countries. I'm no enemy of any of these countries. I've worked with all of them. But they are cracking down on their Russian population. They are outlawing education in the Russian language. They are cracking down on the Russian Orthodox Church. The president of Latvia literally posted, "Russia must be destroyed." He posted that. Russia delenda est, playing on Cato. You kidding? Come on. Let's be grown-ups. Let's sit down and seriously ask the question, what can we do for collective security? It's a very good question. I think there's a lot that can be done. I'm a huge fan of the OSCE, by the way, or used to be when it existed, which is very different from NATO. It's got a completely different concept. The concept is of collective security. The concept is you don't join a bloc that threatens your neighbor. So in any event, I think your question's an absolutely fair one. The Russians say things, they don't get reported. I would like the Europeans at least to try. Has Kaya Kallas gone to the High Representative Vice President? Has she gone to Moscow to talk to Lavrov? No. Has she invited Lavrov to Brussels to speak with her? No. Why not? That's what diplomats are supposed to do. I love diplomacy. I like talking with each other.
Thank you. Emma, do we have another question?
Yes, heading back in time, Svetlana Savvaranskaya asks, in 2000, Putin mentioned to Clinton that Russia wanted to join NATO, and Clinton spoke approvingly of the idea. If Gore had won and there was no war in Iraq, was there any chance of even some kind of associate membership for Russia? What was the impact of the Iraq war on the global order?
Yes, so excellent questions. But Putin said something in an interview in Le Figaro in 2017 that I think is really smart and interesting. He said, presidents come into office with ideas, and then men in dark suits and blue ties come and tell them reality, meaning the CIA or the U.S. security state, and and the leaders, and then he says, and you never hear those ideas again. So apparently, this conversation took place that Putin said, "Yes, I'd like to join NATO," and Clinton said, "Well, yes," and then he later quickly said, "Well, no," because he was advised by the U.S. Security state, no. So the US deep state, which I believe in that concept, meaning the CIA, the Pentagon, the other intelligence agencies, the NSA, the National Security Council, and the Armed Services Committees in the Congress, they have viewed Russia as either a threat or a ripe piece of fruit that's going to fall into their lap ever since 1991. They were not out for good relations with Russia. They were out to basically make Russia fall apart or regime change in Russia. Brzezinski had the idea that Russia would collapse into a kind of three-part weak confederation and so on. So yes, if the United States had treated Russia with respect, if they had seriously talked about NATO, which never was seriously considered in the US side, things could have been different. My own experience as a much younger person back in 1989 to 91, working and admiring enormously Gorbachev and Yeltsin, was they just wanted normal relations. They wanted to end the 75 years of this wrong direction that Russia had taken in the 1917 revolution. They wanted peaceful relations throughout Europe. Gorbachev was, if anything else, a man of peace. And the United States just couldn't treat the other side with respect, dignity, and peaceful relations. It had to be on American terms, beginning to end. That's, in my view, the mistake.
Thank you. Have you met Putin, actually?
I've met him on a couple of occasions, but never had long talks with him. But I know many, many other Russian leaders well.
But you didn't have the chance to look into his blue eyes.
No.
Saw some beautiful person. No?
I did look into his eyes and I said hello. That was it. But never a long conversation.
Sivan, do we have another question?
Yes, we do. So this comes from Brian. He asks, given current disillusionment with American foreign policy, are there historical examples of a different path that you wish would be reinstated in the new global order?
Yeah, so this is a fundamental question that comes to some of the big questions at the opening of our discussion. I think we are in a new era, and that is that, and Secretary Rubio said it early on as in his position as Secretary of State, that we are now in a multipolar world. Now, what multipolarity means is that there are many centers of power. The United States, Russia, China, and India, at the least, are centers of power. If Europe ever gets its act together, it would certainly be a superpower. Right now, it's a divided 27 countries, but it's a $20 trillion economy and a very sophisticated economy. So it would be, and with a nuclear, with nuclear arms in France. So it would be a superpower too. I think we've been multipolar for a long time and that the United States exaggerated its power for a long time. But now it's recognized that we're in a multipolar world. But what's not agreed is what is the implication of that? Is the implication that now the great powers are going to go after each other? Is the implication that they're each going to respect their own turf, but act like bullies in their own neighborhood? Is it going to be that we'll have multipolarity and multilateralism, which is a completely different concept? Multipolarity means there are several powers. Multilateralism means that there is an international rule of law. I'm in favor of multilateralism. I work for the UN. I work with the UN. I believe in the UN. It's extremely weak. I would like to see it strengthened. To my mind, that would go a long way to making the world a safer place. So I want to move to a multipolar, multilateral world. The United States psychologically has a hard time with this. If you read Foreign Affairs magazine, as I do every issue, most of the articles in most of the issues are to reassure the readers that America still is number one. It still dominates China. China's still far from this. China's economy is about to collapse and so forth, none of which I believe for a moment. But I think the United States psychologically, in our ideology, we have been, we've been the leader for a long time. This is the American century. We're the sole superpower and so forth. I think we have to come to the understanding that there can be other powers that are not our enemy. I don't view China as an enemy. I don't even view it as a threat, by the way. China can't invade the United States. China can't defeat the United States. But at the same token, the United States can't invade and defeat China. This is two great powers. And I think there's a lot of mutual benefit in good relations. So that's the kind of world that I would like to move to: multilateral, stronger United Nations. I'm not in favor of the sovereigntist argument, which is the Trump administration argument that a great power like the United States requires freedom of action. We do what we want. No one tells us what to do, least of all the UN. That point of view, I don't agree, because I believe that we rightfully bind ourselves to international agreements so that we can cooperate with each other and reduce conflict. That's why we have the rule of law. That's the Hobbes-Locke idea of the social contract, which I believe we need at the global level.
Thank you. How can you be so sure that we are moving towards or have already arrived at a multipolar world? Doesn't it look at the moment as if we were heading towards a new bipolar world, only this time China and the United States, or the United States and China? Because the European Union, as you rightly said, isn't really on the same level. Neither is Russia, I would say, and India isn't either. So isn't it really still bipolar with lots of disciples to each of these powers?
Yeah, I tend to look at this through an economic lens. So I look at the size of the economies, at their productive capacity, and of their likely trajectory. And when I do that, I don't see China, for example, as becoming the world's hegemon, certainly not. I don't see the United States disappearing from sight. I do see India becoming much more powerful. because it's going to be the most populous country in the world by a wide margin. Maybe it will be 400 or 500 million larger than China within maybe 30 years. I don't have the UN projections immediately in front of me, but it's going to go to 1.7 billion, whereas China's peaked. And China's on a trajectory to get to under 1 billion people by the end of this century. So when I do the kind of the back of the envelope calculations, China's share of world output is basically peaking about now because of the population decline that's coming. India's will rise, Africa's will rise, and Europe is going to get its act together somehow. I don't know whether it'll be now or 5 years or 10 years, but Europe is a civilization, even though it's fought each other for 1,500 years ever since the fall of the Western Roman Empire. But nonetheless, Europe will get its act together. So we'll be in a multipolar world, not a bipolar world. For the moment, the US and China definitely lead, for example, in AI, in many key technologies. But I was just in India last week. The progress is very rapid. The scientific and technical skills are rapid. The India space program is rapid. Technology diffuses. Smart people are all over the place. If there's peace, there will be what we call economic convergence, which is that the poorer countries will grow faster than the richer countries.
Talk to us briefly about how you see the China-US relationship. You know, in the US, there's still lots of anti-China hawks around. And also in China, the suspicion of the United States is pretty high.
Absolutely.
And so how is that going to develop? Do you see military conflict, or do you believe military conflict, for example, about Taiwan can be avoided successfully?
First, from a kind of normative point of view, I do not view China as a threat, as I explained. And I do not view trade with China as a losing proposition from the United States point of view. I view it as a win-win for China and the US. I've been going to China now for 44 years. I've watched the development. Chinese people have worked extraordinarily hard and long hours. They've educated their young people. They have built tens of thousands of kilometers of modern infrastructure. They've saved at extraordinary rates. In other words, they've worked very hard for what they've achieved. I admire it. I admire Chinese civilization. And I think we would do well to have good relations with China. Is that the way things are going right now? No. The United States views China as in Graham Allison's description of the Thucydides trap, as the danger of a rising power coming to claim America's crown. Of course, I don't view the world that way. I don't think there's one crown. I think there's one planet, and we ought to cooperate on it. But if you're really obsessed with the question of who's number one and who's number two, well, then China looks like a threat to you. So the United States views China as a threat. And this can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. John Mearsheimer, who I regard as a really great political scientist and a very dear friend, says, yes, as China rises, conflict with the United States is inevitable. He doesn't mean violent conflict inevitable, but he says it's possible. And I said, John, but it's a self-fulfilling prophecy to say that. And he said, yes, that's right, Jeff. I said, John, why do we need a self-fulfilling prophecy of conflict? He said, because that's how the world is. His book is called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. I refuse to accept tragedy as our baseline. I want cooperation. And I want us to consciously aim at cooperation, but first to tone down the fear mongering. I would like some American congressman to get a passport and go see China and understand it a bit rather than just railing against it in Washington.
Thank you. We have a few minutes time if you are not exhausted yet, Jeffrey. Can I ask Emma to ask the next question, please?
Yes, on the note of China, Andrew Pruden asks, China beats the US in many national security industries, for example, 90% of all global shipbuilding, and the US is no longer capable of acting as the arsenal of democracy in a future great power war. If tariffs are not the key to revamping US industry and manufacturing, what steps can the US take?
Not to go to war. This is clear. We shouldn't think that we're preparing for war. We are absolutely as safe as a country can be in this world with, as Donald Trump says, two big oceans and a nuclear arsenal and a powerful military. We're not going to be invaded. China could not invade us. China could not defeat the United States under any circumstance. And we shouldn't plan on defeating China. So we should engage in diplomacy because we have mutual deterrence, and that's good. And mutual deterrence means neither side can defeat the other side. We don't need an arms race to secure that. And we should chill out a bit. We are very powerful and powerful enough to defend ourselves, not powerful enough to run the world, but who wants to run the world? Let the world run for each place, and let's have peace.
Thank you. Sivan.
Yes, so this is an anonymous question. And it asks about how you mentioned earlier the idea of neutrality for Ukraine as having worked for Austria in the past. How do you think the issue of neutrality, which seems to be impossible for Taiwan, would shape up in the kind of trilateral PRC, Taiwan, and US relationship?
Yeah, the difference with Taiwan is part of China. Interestingly, there are two governments, one in Beijing, one in Taipei. This is the legacy of China's civil war. Both of them unequivocally said there is one China. They argued, the Republic of China in Taipei, about who rules China. They said, we rule. Of course, the PRC say, we rule. Both agree there is one China. When the United States recognized the People's Republic of China, it, like every other country that has diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China, which is essentially almost all the world, adopts the one China policy. It agrees that there is one China. The United States should not intervene across the Taiwan Straits. That's the best safety for Taiwan. Ironically, it's analogous structurally to all the problems I was discussing about Ukraine. If the United States says to Taiwan, we protect you, we defend you no matter what, and some Taiwanese president or politician says, okay, then we're independent because the United States has our back, there will be war. If instead there is prudence and there's no independence declaration, there's no attempt from the point of view of Beijing to break up China, then there will be peace. The best way to protect Taiwan, it's a little ironic, but it's the same as what happened in Ukraine. The best way to protect Taiwan is for the United States to stop its meddling and especially to stop shipping armaments to Taiwan. China would lose enormously if it invaded Taiwan. And it won't invade Taiwan unless Taiwan declares independence, in which case it will invade Taiwan. And that is the basic structural situation. The United States should not provoke a disaster.
Once again, a very controversial view that the US should not provide weapons to Taiwan.
I think it's the most safety we could give to Taiwan.
Strategic ambiguity is still the policy you would endorse, I take it.
I don't agree with that.
Or-
I don't agree with ambiguity as being helpful at all. I believe in clarity. And I believe the United States should say clearly, we believe in one country, one China policy. We believe in peace across the straits. We would regard a Chinese military action against Taiwan as being disastrous for China, for Taiwan, and for the world, and we strongly oppose it, but we do not interfere by shipping weapons
But
to Taiwan.
the one China policy is official American policy, isn't it?
It is, but it's not treated that way. Or it's, this is why the ambiguity to my mind is not so clever. I would just be explicit.
Okay, thank you. Can we take two more questions and then we go because you must get tired.
Maybe one more, if that's okay.
One more question. Emma, would you be so kind?
Jumping back to an earlier discussion on tariffs and the Fed and criticisms with the Trump administration, will Trump succeed in replacing Jerome Powell before his term ends in February 2028? Given the GOP's current majority in the Senate, would it make sense for Trump to try to replace Powell before the 2026 election, since the Senate would have to confirm his nomination? If not, who is he likely to nominate to replace him in 2028?
Well, very good questions. Let me just say that the Fed's independence is important, and it's very important that we not have one person rule in the United States. So if the president can set tariff rates, if the president can start or stop wars by himself, if Congress abnegates all responsibility, if independent agencies like the Federal Reserve lose their independence, we lose a lot of the functioning of our system, which, going back to the brilliance of 1787 in Philadelphia, was based on checks and balances, which I continue to believe in.